Hello, I'm Dalton Deland. I'm a columnist for the Berkshire Eagle, and this is Eagle Reels, where we take you beyond the news. Our guest, Kasey Meehan, Program Director for the Freedom to Read Project of PEN America. Welcome, Kasey.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Recently, Heather Bello, our investigative reporter, reported on an incident in which the police were called to the W.E.B. Du Bois Middle School in Great Barrington because an 8th grade class was using Genderqueer by Maya Kobabe, an illustrated memoir, which I'm told is the most banned book in America. Can you tell us about this?
Sure. So, Genderqueer, as you said, is one of the most frequently banned books across public schools over the last 2.5 years. In terms of the case itself, unfortunately, it's not the first time we've seen this happen, if you can believe that or not. What I would love to point to is just the continued escalation of where this book banning movement is going to all the way up to including, your sheriff's office or your police department. And it just, it's an alarming case. And I think, again, we just see continued efforts to restrict books like Genderqueer that include representation of LGBTQ plus characters, as well as other books with different and similar themes that are really, being targeted under this movement.
Sex, gender, quote unquote, inappropriate material is the most likely to be called into question in schools. Is this an overreaction, or are community standards relevant at times?
Community standards are, of course, relevant. I think what's happening in this current wave, or I can say I know what's happening in this current wave, is a much more coordinated, well-resourced campaign to remove certain types of books. And again, these books are overwhelmingly books that feature LGBTQ plus identities, or books that include characters of color, as well as books that do talk about sex and sexuality. But, they do so in a way that is appropriate, that is intentionally designed, curated, brought into schools with young people in mind. And you mentioned some of the language here that's being used, what's appropriate. We've heard books being labeled as obscene and pornographic. And oftentimes, again, these terms are being conflated to what actually is happening. And when we look at the full scope of the book banning movement, overwhelmingly, 75% of these books that are being banned, challenged and banned from schools are young adult books, middle grade books, picture books. So these are books that, again, were intentionally designed, curated, and brought into books with young people in mind. So they do not meet any sort of colloquial or legal definition of some of these more provocative terms that we see being tossed around.
Kasey, are you ever seeing cases in which the age or grade is a real question? Do you think that any of this material is actually getting into elementary school, or a level in which perhaps there's valid question about what is the appropriate age to talk about these sorts of issues?
Yeah, those questions are valid questions. And there have always been a place for parents with students in a grade or school to have those kind of conversations with their educator directly, or with their librarian, or with their district administrators. So, questions around age appropriateness, I think that's, something that we all continue to grapple with. But for PEN America, what's important here is, again, that this is a really coordinated movement that is looking to restrict certain types of books and really pulls away the kind of the professional expertise that we have always looked towards in our educators and librarians, who are trained and well adjudicated to, make decisions around what is and is not developmentally appropriate for students, and to engage, with parents or others who may have questions about, that what is and is not, age or developmentally appropriate.
Kasey, when you say a coordinated movement, and of course, we live in America where conspiracy theory is the lifeblood of the nation.
For sure, I understand.
We're still debating the Zapruder tapes. But when you say that, is that a loose term, or is there literally, or are there political groups that are at the center of a movement that perhaps has purpose beyond exactly what it is supposedly doing?
Yeah, and more so than even political groups. I mean, we are watching sort of extremists in this moment, either extreme politicians or advocacy groups that have a very clear agenda to be removing certain types of books from schools. And again, often there's lots of rhetoric being tossed around. So often we hear this as rhetoric under, a parental rights movement where parents are looking for a stronger, more engaged say in what is happening in public schools. And again, that's all fine and well. Parents do have an important voice in their public school and their kids' public schooling and their schooling in general. But again, what we see happening is the way in which localized advocacy groups with the, meet legislation that's being passed across states, often by Republican-led legislators or governor's offices, that is just, continuing to see certain types of books removed from access for students. So in that sense, it's quite coordinated. We have been able to track different types of advocacy groups across the country that are having an outsized influence in school district level decision making, as well as the introduction of this legislation that is also, kind of building on the movement that really started locally to impose, again, legislation that is prohibiting certain types of books from being in classroom and school libraries.
I don't know whether this is coincidental, Kasey, or I'd love your opinion on when you were talking about that and Republican-led state legislatures. I guess I'm thinking particularly example would be perhaps Texas and Greg Abbott.
Sure.
It almost appears that anti-abortion movements and parental rights, quote unquote, and school bannings, they seem to go together. Is that true? Is this all part of a sort of cultural conservative effort?
I think there are many ways that, a heightened cultural, a heightened conservative movement, as you said, is playing out. And certainly the way in which it's playing out across public schools is absolutely true. Oftentimes we point to many of this starting sort of right after the pandemic, when there was lots of debates about whether schools should be open or closed, whether we should be, encouraging vaccinations in schools and not. And sort of that what happened there around sort of the conflicts that we saw playing out about public schools during the pandemic have really sort of continued to manifest themselves, one way of which is around book bans and the books that should or should not be available for students in schools. But I think you're also right that it's, connected. Often, we track groups like Moms for Liberty. We certainly are following legislation out of Governor Abbott's office, as well as Governor DeSantis and Governor Reynolds in Iowa. And they do, there's sort of similarities across much of the legislation that's being proposed and implemented from, these Republican held states, that are having similar effects around really removing, again, certain like large amounts, right? Like we're talking about books over the last 2.5 years. PEN America has recorded over 6,000, like nearly 6,000 instances of book bans. So this is quite at scale. Where we're seeing legislation have, again, these really enormous, disastrous effects on removing certain types of books. And it's not just the removing of books, if I can keep going here. It's also, we are putting librarians and educators really at the crosshairs. And there's legislation that's enacted that threatens criminalization of librarians who are deemed as giving away material that somebody may deem as inappropriate or obscene. In Florida, there's language around educators may lose their certification. So it's really quite heightened. So while we often point to the books because we can quantify it, there's something, almost deeper and a bit more insidious playing out that comes from legislation, that comes from a heightened atmosphere of fear and intimidation around what the role of educators are, what the role of librarians is, and how public schools are really designed to educate a pluralistic society.
Kasey, the next big category, I think, of banned or adulterated books concerns race. The classic Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn. It uses the word, perhaps just of its time, perhaps for actual purpose, the N-word 219 times. I think virtually all school texts of that book now, if used at all, replace the word with slave. Is this somehow helpful to keep the book in use, or is this whitewashing history in some way that damages us because perhaps even the worst parts of history should be learned?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really hard question. I think PEN America takes a really principled position when we come to this around that we don't want to see works that are edited or removed. And our executive director, in relation to the recent Ronald Dahl revisions, said something really strong around we might cheer specific edits, but should in fact consider how the power to rewrite books might be used in the hands with those who do not share, the values and sensibilities that you have. So that's the real risk. I mean, we maintain a principled stance against these forms of censorship, so that if there are individuals who are editing perhaps in the other way, how would that be reflected? And with Huckleberry Finn, what's interesting, of course, is that the United States has lots of episodic moments of book banning, and Huckleberry Finn is one of those books that has been, challenged at different points in time for different reasons. Contemporarily, we see it challenged for the use of, some language that we would consider dated at this point, and that, not appropriate for people to necessarily be saying in the classroom space. And there's also a current movement. When we talk about this current book banning movement, there are many books that are being banned that also include characters of color and are talking about race and racism in ways that perhaps are less dated and more kind of relevant to a contemporary, young person's understanding of the world around. So The Hate U Give is a great example of a book that is often challenged and banned and looks at police violence and the way a young Black person is, receiving news and navigating a moment like that, which we all know to be playing out sort of in real time and something that young people are exposed to. So there's kind of, I would say in some ways race, thinking about race is not next. It's quite current in the way in which the book banning movement also, again, with the conflation of legislation like, Stop Woke in Florida, as it's colloquially called, or other pieces of legislation that are prohibiting divisive conversations and content in classroom. I mean, once again, we see the way in which content in books on characters of color or books that are talking about race and racism are, continue to be challenged and banned.
As a writer myself, Kasey, I guess I think we've talked about Dahl, Mark Twain, but the list is quite incredible. Dr. Seuss, Agatha Christie, Ian Fleming, Ursula K. Le Guin, Hergé. We could go on and on. And I guess my question is the following. In the terrible choice between perhaps three things: banning a book, or adulterating the work of a dead author who can't say anymore, which seems somehow wrong to me as a writer, or perhaps prefacing such books so that we provide context. Where does Penn come out on this? I guess to me the worst sin is the adulteration.
I don't, it's hard to, I know, I feel to stack those three. I think we have been, again, sort of our principled approach is really against, in this moment has really been against the banning, the removing of books from access. I think for me and others on the team, often like our guiding star is kind of, do students have access? And if not, like what is that about? And that is a real threat to students' understanding of themselves, of the world around them. So, certainly I might put, banning like as top of the list of things that we do not stand for. And, I think there are opportunities, and perhaps this is where maybe it's a little bit, more gray and book and context specific and market specific. And, there's lots of different types of books. It could be, a classic that's been adapted for young people, and maybe that takes a different kind of frame than your traditional, classic text. So understanding there's all this nuance that plays into there. I certainly think contextualizing is super helpful, in the way in which books with some language that currently may be dated could also be used to educate, when it's delivered with the right context and content from a librarian or an educator or a parent or whoever. So I think that's an important note to consider too. I don't know how I would rank all three across. Yeah.
Kasey, we're at the beginning of a new year. PEN America reports that in the last school year, there was a 33% rise in book banning. Prediction, is this continuing in this trend? Is there any countervailing wind? What do you see occurring?
I mean, I think, many of us are ready to see this effort suspended. But unfortunately, if the tea leaves from the first half of the school year do suggest that we are still seeing kind of a mounting rise of book bans. Again, I've pointed to legislation. Many pieces of legislation were enacted last year. So this school year is kind of the first time we're seeing the way it's being, how districts are responding to legislation more broadly. And just this week, we saw a school district in Florida remove 600 books out of compliance to this legislation. There's another district in Florida that has a list of over 1,000 books that they have pulled and now are going through review to meet this legislation. So, the role of legislation, I think, is going to to kind of just ramp up the number of books. So rather than having individuals or groups kind of challenge 10, 20, 100 books, now we're seeing a complete removal and suspension of classroom libraries, of school libraries, of thousands of books that are going under review in order to make sure that they meet compliance. So, in some ways the playing field keeps changing, and we do see the way in which it's ramping up. But I do want to give some light here, in that wherever we see book banning, we have, more and more we see very coordinated, kind of counter-coordinated efforts to keep books on shelves, to oppose book banning, and to really defend the freedom to read. So there are advocacy groups, popping up all over, student-led, parent-led, librarian-led, retired librarians are always, such an incredible voice that understand, what the process is for how books end up on shelves and what it means to be restricting books based on narrow ideological preferences. So there's, just an incredible group and a growing group of individuals who are really, and groups that are pushing back and saying, these books, students deserve these books in classrooms, and to remove them because of this viewpoint discrimination is quite harmful and goes against the very essence of our democracy and the, intent of our educational system.
This almost Fahrenheit 451 like criminalization of librarians, for example, a group of people that perhaps we have tropes and myths about that are simply, the most gentle and so forth. And now, we're creating this image that these are people endangering our children. Is this beginning to play out? Are people leaving that field? Is this going to have a deleterious impact on people literally going into this work?
Yeah, I mean, of course, unfortunately, how could it not? Already these are two professions that, individuals and advocacy groups in education have pointed to, falling rates. There are already, educator shortages, and there are already not enough librarians. And we already know that, with funding constraints, that many schools, districts, states do not even have, a school library in every school across their public district. So, there are already constraints on these professions, and this is just yet another added constraint. And we certainly are hearing, unfortunately, too many cases of librarians who are stepping away, of educators who are, switching fields or moving into different states, even to at best navigate what is happening to them in their profession, their field.
Kasey, finally, who should either decide, or let's just say even have a place at the table? Teachers and librarians, school boards, parents, politicians? Do you have a feeling about this, or is there a best way for us to navigate as a society the interest now of groups outside of the schools themselves in something that we would have thought previously was the internal work of pedagogy?
Yeah, I mean, I think, my gut says, like, all of us, right? Like, we all have a really contributing role here. And what the counter effect of what actually is happening is a very vocal minority who is, having an outsized influence on schools. But certainly teachers, parents, school boards, even, of course, politicians who are thinking about funding and curricula and standards. We all have a role to play in upholding our public school system and advancing a public school system that truly serves our pluralistic society. And I think that's really what's at threat here, is that we are seeing, a very narrow group of individuals and actors have an outsized influence on this system that we all share and contribute to.
Kasey Meehan, thank you for joining us today, and thanks to the work of PEN America and PEN International, which I know operates in 100 countries, and the work of defending writing and defending journalism is critically important in these times we're in. Viewers, thank you for watching. If you're already a subscriber to the Berkshire Eagle, we appreciate that. If you're not yet a subscriber, please consider becoming one. It is by the continuance of local journalism in America that we help keep our conversation alive in this country. I'm Dalton DeLand. I'll see you next time on Eagle Reels and in the pages of the Berkshire Eagle.